Welcome, everyone, to this session on Catholic spiritualities. I'd like to say a bit about mission spiritualities in a time of trauma from a Catholic perspective, but probably not exclusively so. So first, the definition of spirituality. Spirituality can be understood as a tradition of personal and communal piety and practices and an engagement with the world that is biblically based and often inspired by the example of holy men and women. Their witness helps us to understand how spiritualities can be understood as charisms, as gifts of the Spirit, ordinary gifts that are lasting, and extraordinary gifts that are given for a particular time. So the question we will try to answer is, what are the spiritualities that can be identified within the Roman Catholic tradition that offer us encouragement, support, and hope in the midst of these times of trauma? So to begin that conversation, I turn now to my colleague, Professor Ernesto Valiente.
Thank you so much, Meg. So let me say a few words about liberating spirituality in a suffering world. Latin American liberationist spirituality begins to develop in the late 1970s, partially as a corrective to neoscholastic spiritualities that emerged during the period before Vatican II, before the 1960s. Liberation theologians often criticize these spiritualities because of their elitist, escapist, and individual features. Elitist because these spiritualities were not intended for everybody, but for a small group. That is, they were usually envisioned for priests, nuns, monks, and religious professionals. There were some exceptions, of course, but lay people were usually not expected to develop spirituality, and very often, and very few of them had any access to formal spiritual training. These neo-scholastic spiritualities also tended to divide reality into two separate planes of existence, the sacred and the profane. Within this dualistic understanding of reality, it was often assumed that in order to encounter God, one needed to raise above the materiality of the daily life. Consequently, these spiritualities often foster what can be described as a fuga mundi, escape from the world. Finally, these spiritualities also tended to be hyper-individualistic in that they overemphasize one's personal relationship with God. The problem is that such emphasis was often achieved by disregarding social and political responsibilities in such a way that the Christian faith seemed to be disconnected from daily life and from our relationship to others. Rooted in the faith practice of the Latin American people and drawing from the insights of Vatican II, liberation theologians articulated a new spirituality that sought to respond to the context and challenge of the Latin American situation. The novel and corrective character of these spiritualities is particularly evident in the assumptions that ground them. Let me mention at least three of these assumptions. First, a liberating spirituality acknowledges the distinction between the human and the divine planes of existence, but it rejects a sharp separation between these two planes. Because this spirituality is rooted in a deeply sacramental view of the world, it sees the divine present in the human, the spiritual present in the material, and the eternal present in the historical. This means that we encounter God not only in the scriptures, or not only in the scriptures, or in our liturgies, or in our personal devotions, but also in our daily life. This is not to say that this spirituality equates God with the world, or that we live in a total harmonious history. On the contrary, it recognizes that we live in a world riddled by conflict, division, and violence. That is, in a suffering world that reflects the clash between grace and sin, justice and injustice, between compassion and indifference. A second basic assumption in the liberating spirituality is that unity should exist between the complementary moments of contemplation and action. Contemplation is the moment in which we recognize God's initiative and appreciate God's love for us and the world. This is the moment of the human silence, when we hear God's word in our personal prayers, in our acts of devotion, in our liturgies. Action, on the other hand, refers to a response to God's invitation, to God's word. Action includes those activities that reflect our effort to collaborate with God's will, our acts of charity, our services towards others, and our social and political practices. While contemplation and action are two distinct moments in the spiritual life, they are also deeply interrelated. They continuously illuminate each other and converge in a manner in which we encounter God in the world. So, theologians like John Sobrino explain that we must contemplate God not only in our moments of solitude and in our liturgies, but also in our mundane interactions. We must learn to discern God's presence in our daily lives and in the busyness of this world. The third assumption, perhaps, is one of the most significant features of liberation theology and liberation spirituality: the preferential option for the poor. This preference underscores that spirituality does not develop in the vacuum, but in a communal context that seeks to respond to the sign of the times. Set within the context of widespread injustice, conflict, and marginalization, many Latin American Christians have discerned that the Spirit is inviting them to live in solidarity with the poor and to collaborate in their integral liberation. Hence, spirituality touches on all aspects of human existence. Because God's presence permeates the world, spirituality has to do with the manner in which a person relates to others, in which the person relates to society, to creation, and to God. So far, I have talked about spirituality in general. But when we speak of Christian spirituality of liberation, theologians stress the central role of Jesus Christ. Christian spirituality, they say, is none other than following Jesus, engaging the world today in the way that Jesus taught us. Christian spirituality entails embracing the path and the spirit that constitute Jesus' life. It is being and doing in today's terms who Jesus was and what Jesus did. This following is better described as a creative appropriation of Jesus' life according to our temperaments, our gifts, our vocations, and the situation in which we live. Hence, this spirituality means that, like Jesus, we must incarnate ourselves in the situation in which we live. But this incarnation also calls for a spirit of honesty that enables us to grasp the truth and recognize the world for what it is. This spirit of honesty enables us to distinguish, to discern the presence of sin and grace in our particular situation. This spirit of honesty seeks to unmask the ideologies that attempt to justify our social and economic arrangements, to expose society's false assumptions, its idolatry towards the market, and its disregard for the environment. When people of Latin America incarnated in their situation with a spirit of honesty, they encounter an unjust and suffering world, a world in need of transformation, of justice, but above all, a world that elicits compassion. As in Jesus' life, compassion becomes the central virtue, the spirit that informs. As followers of Jesus, we are given the same mission entrusted to Christ, to pursue the fullest realization of God's kingdom as the best alternative to heal our suffering world. Our collaboration in Jesus' mission then embarks us in a long journey that entails struggling against what is negative and fostering what is positive in the world. This mission on behalf of the kingdom is a mission of compassion that takes different forms depending upon our particular situation. However, in Latin America, compassion has become practical in the active quest for social justice, the protection of our environment, and even in the willingness to extend forgiveness to the oppressors. Because in this journey, in this mission, we can become discouraged by our own limitations, by the apparent lack of progress, and by the opposition of those who want to keep the status quo, it is important that we appropriate a spirit of fidelity. If you want to call it, and a spirit of resilience. Indeed, a long list of Latin American martyrs also explain why this spirituality calls for a spirit of fidelity. We are very aware that those who follow Jesus are often persecuted and nailed like Jesus to the cross. Hence, this spirit strengthens us and helps us persevere in our original honesty and compassion, even if our mission may lead us to the final sacrifice. But Jesus' resurrection has also shown us that injustice and death do not have the last word. Jesus and the recent Latin American martyrs have left us a legacy of honesty, faithfulness, and love. Jesus and our martyrs show us that reality not only makes difficult demands upon us, but also contains a grace that carries us and lightens our burden. That life is not only suffering and negativity, but also hope and joy. As John Sobrino notes, insofar as we follow the crucified Jesus, the resurrected Christ becomes present in our lives. This spirit of trust enables us to rise above our attachments and incarnate more deeply in the world. It helps us love without barriers and thus become utterly available to God. This spirit of trust is evident in the life and spirituality that our saints and martyrs model for us. Think about Monsignor Romero, Dorothy Stang, or Martin Luther King. This is also the life that God is inviting us to embrace. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neto. What I'd like to pick up on is one of the historical spiritualities in the life of the church, which is the Franciscan spirituality, one that I embraced long ago as a young person, and which I'd like to share a few insights with you because of the ways that I think it continues to apply in today's world, especially in these times of trauma. So what were some of the essential elements of this Franciscan spirituality? Well, it takes us back to Francis of Assisi himself and of an experience that he has early on in his life, which is the encounter with Christ crucified. In a church, a little chapel falling into ruin, Francis approaches and experiences the voice of Christ crucified saying to him, "Go rebuild my church." Francis initially took that as a very concrete mandate. He got bricks and mortar and stones and got people to help him to rebuild this tiny little chapel of San Damiano. But as his life went on, he discovered that that mandate wasn't meant just for that moment, that that mandate had a much larger horizon. And it wasn't only about rebuilding the church, it really was about rebuilding the world. And it's in that sense that we get our appropriation, if you will, of this Franciscan spiritual tradition, meant certainly for times of trauma, which that 13th century was, of peacemaking, of care for the earth, of recognizing everyone as brother and sister, And to pick up on something that Neto referred to, understanding more fully the mystery of the Incarnation. The Franciscan theologian John Duns Scotus helps us to fill this out even more. This inspiration with regard to the imitation of Christ that doesn't only relate to the mysteries of liberation, of salvation, of setting people free, of curing people, but of God's first intention to be one with us, or what we might call a spirituality of presence, a spirituality of incarnate presence that calls us to be one with others as our first approach to others as brothers and sisters. When we think of this spirituality of presence, in a way inspired by this Franciscan tradition, it engenders hope. It enables us to see truly that we are ambassadors of reconciliation. And in this time of trauma, as we think of the reality of our world, millions of people dead as a consequence of COVID. As we look at the realities of racial injustice and so many other forms of injustice that have traumatized the human spirit in countless ways, how do we turn to these spiritual resources for support, for encouragement? And by that I mean that we have the courage to act and to inspire hope in others to this incarnate mystery of God with us. How are we the witnesses to that significant message of our Christian tradition? And how is it that out of that, love flows? Love flows into hope and fidelity, into courage and compassion, and most of all, to joy, which is not about happiness, but it's a recognition that death does not have the last word, that our joy ultimately is found in knowing that we follow a God who has risen from the dead and drawn us into new life. And how that experience is one that is temporal as well as eschatological. So I'll stop there for now. And Neto, anything to add as our time runs out?
Oh, I think that you complemented very well with your Franciscan spirituality, the Latin American spirituality. So I think we are ready for questions and a bigger conversation.
And so later on, when we turn to questions, I guess one of the questions that I would leave you with is, how do you see your own experience of call to go and to rebuild the world and the church in this time of trauma? Neto, do you have a specific question?
Yes, perhaps I would ask our participants, what is the role that compassion and forgiveness plays in in their daily lives? Because I find that especially forgiveness so challenging. So it's a good one to look at.
And so as we conclude our presentation, I would draw us back to one of the words that Neto introduced to us, one of the experiences, which is that of resiliency. In this time of trauma in which our world is passing, what will be the role of our understanding and our hopefulness in attempting to bring about an experience of resiliency, especially in the lives of people who have lost so much? What will constitute this experience of resiliency and the knowledge that God is with us?